My grandparents used to live on the side of a red rock mountain in a city in the Sonoran Desert. It wasn't like they were alone there, living in solitude or anything. It was an entire town with shops and houses. I had to go visit whenever I had breaks from school. I'm saying that I had to, not because I didn't like it there, but because I found that place extremely creepy. I had a cousin about my age that used to play with me and would also stay at my grandparents' home during breaks. It was the only times I get to see him. We were the type of kids that would climb trees, play N64 until late at night, and stay up watching Are You Afraid of the Dark and MTV most of the nights until the electricity cut out at one point. It was part of the creepy town. Then in the morning, Grandma would knock on the door and find us on the floor somewhere. She'd usually see that I was awake and invite me over to the kitchen, where she'd serve amazing scrambled eggs with homemade bread. Grandpa had usually gone out to work or out to the stores to get things very early in the morning, and since my cousin would sleep until late, I got to spend a lot of time with Grandma, asking her questions about our family, the town, and sometimes she'd start talking about the news, which frankly I didn't understand at the time. There was one thing that got my attention pretty quickly. She had heard a segment on the radio about reports of dogs going missing and appearing a few days later as if nothing had happened. And she claimed to know one of the owners of a missing dog. Grandma used to know a lot of people in town, and I got to meet many of them because they used to stop by the house to have coffee with Grandma almost every morning. From what I remember, Grandma had two main groups of friends. One of the groups was made up of 4 older women who stopped on their way back home from doing the shopping and would have coffee and bread from my grandma's kitchen. I was fascinated by them. They knew a lot of stories, talking about their sons, things that they heard on the radio. And I think one of them was a writer or a journalist because she would always write things down and look through her notes as she started talking to the group. Since Grandma didn't have a television in the living room, I would just sit there at the table with a pencil and a piece of paper, drawing random things on there while they talked about their days. But Grandma's second group of friends, the gossip ladies, would stop by a little later, excited with a story to share. I knew my grandma pretty well, and it was hard even back then to watch her trying to change the topics that these women would bring up, even in front of me. Things about murders, gossip about who got pregnant, and witchcraft. See, I could tell from one of them that she either practiced it or was very into it. She would carry around strange cards in her purse and would hold on to a stone in her hand. Her recommendations to help people get out of trouble was to go to the woman on 34th Street and to tell them that, quote, Claudia sent you. See, I even remember her name from how often she would say that. So one time, on a Saturday, my cousin was fast asleep in the room and wouldn't wake up no matter what. So Grandma invited me down to the kitchen for strawberry jam she had made. When suddenly, the gossip ladies showed up. Well, 2 of them. Claudia and another woman I hadn't seen before. They were by the front door, peeking inside the house and calling for my grandma as we were coming down the stairs. I was so excited to eat that I forgot to put my shoes on, and my white socks were now red from stepping on the bricks that made up the stairs. Grandma asked me to go put my shoes on while she saw what the crazies wanted. Her words, not mine. So when I got back upstairs, my cousin had woken up and was asking me who was in the kitchen. It was hard to ignore the high-pitched voice that echoed up the hall, and waking up my cousin was not easy. As I was putting my shoes on, Joey, my cousin, said something to me that genuinely scared me. I told you that the house was creepy enough already, just like you would imagine older places to be. But add to that the jagged red rocks in the surrounding areas, along with the strange neighbors who can spot a new person in town through their windows, like birds of prey. Just tell me who it is, Joey said, completely worried. I heard her say my name. It's Claudia, I said, confused because Joey had to sit through her chatter several times already. No, I know Claudia. The other one. Who is the other lady? I don't know. Let's go? Joey looked down at the floor. He sat on his bed, probably expecting me to wait there with him until they left. But then I heard Grandpa's voice at the door. He didn't like those women around the house and didn't mind telling them to leave. "Wake up, both of you. Let's go see what Grandma made." Now, Grandpa was friendly, but everything he said sounded like a command. Always. Joey's face lit up. He knew it would be okay to walk downstairs now. He simply put on his shoes and tucked the laces in as he hurried to walk downstairs with Grandpa, who had been at the door and starting to walk toward the staircase. I heard Grandpa sigh as he heard Claudia and the other woman downstairs. The last one down was Joey. We all felt the other woman's gaze as she looked straight at him and said good morning. Joey got in front of me and hid behind Grandpa. "You're telling nonsense to these boys," Grandpa said. I'm not sure if that was a question. Mr., the woman replied. I think she had forgotten my grandpa's name. Yeah, Grandpa replied, interrupting and then looking over at Grandma, who was wiping down the table for Joey and I to sit down. The women said their goodbyes very quickly and only once, surprisingly, before leaving. "Henderson's is on," Grandpa said, walking over to the radio. I have to say the mood changed quickly after the women left. Suddenly, Joey's weird reaction and Grandpa's mood got better. Grandma was always smiling, so I guess she stayed the same. I became more relaxed. The radio announcer mentioned a few things about missing canines. I think that meant dogs. And the suspicious sightings of the Red Woman. Coined something like, "The Red Woman returns," as a caller, a woman who sounded a lot like Claudia, but wasn't, reporting a mysterious sighting off of one of the peaks of the hills, as she went out to check on her animals the previous night. A second caller, this time a man, called in to comment on the woman's sighting and said that he saw her too, through his bedroom window as she sang in a whisper. All of us stared around the table as the man explained what she looked like, claiming that instead the woman was in a white dress, not in red, but it was stained with the dirt of the rocks, and that her hair was even longer than the previous caller had mentioned. At one point, he even said that the woman wasn't a woman, but rather a humanoid creature. I think he really wanted to argue with the previous caller. At this point, Grandma would have told Grandpa to turn off the radio because we were around. And I could tell she was tempted to, but she was also very curious, just like the rest of us. Nobody noticed Joey sinking lower and lower in his chair until he covered his ears as we all turned to look at him. He looked right at Grandma and asked what the women wanted and how the other lady knew his name. Grandpa looked at her too. Grandma explained to us the most chilling thing I had ever heard, and as time went by, I started considering it too much for it to be a simple coincidence. The women had come to the house at the request of Beth, the woman Joey and I had never seen and who had been at the house with Claudia. And it was true. Joey did have sleeping issues, just like Beth said, and Grandma would leave his medicine by the television for him to take. But Joey and I wanted to stay up late, and he knew that the medicine would make him sleepy. So sometimes he'd skip taking it. I learned later through Joey that he talked in his sleep sometimes, which explained the drowsy voices I'd hear at night. But Grandma also told us about the strange phenomenon of the town. Something sort of like a legend, but was told not to take it so seriously. At 3 a.m, the town became silent, almost naturally. Stories went around that it was because of the formation of the hills that the wind stopped blowing at that time, or something to do with the release of heat from the baked rocks at that specific time. But nothing made real sense. But that silence, Beth believed, was intentional and caused by a spirit. See, no dogs barked at that time. No cats screamed, no one made noise. No sirens, music, nothing. Some even say that the insects stopped buzzing around. Grandpa looked at us and agreed. He said that he used to walk in the middle of the night for his old job at the bakery, and that it was true. His footsteps would almost echo through the night at that time. But also he said that it was part of every town, because who else would be up at that time? What was there to do, he asked. Grandma said that Beth, familiar with these types of things, had gotten a message, a warning, about the young boy of the dried river, Joey. The grandparents lived by an old dried-up stream. Beth knew right away where the house was and contacted Claudia to bring her to talk to Grandma. And there was no doubt in that other lady's mind that the dogs had gone missing for breaking the silence of the dark hour. Tales of people going missing, usually newcomers to the town, were far too many. Though Grandma said that they were only stories. But Joey's story was different. Joey had already gotten a warning. He was half asleep when the tree by our window stopped rattling with the wind. And according to him, I was sleeping like a rock. He felt himself speaking, like he normally would when he skipped the medicine, but didn't know what he was saying. I vaguely remembered Joey's voice. But then he opened his eyes to look out the window, as he saw the stained dress pass by. He was awake now and staring directly out the window as he saw the wide smile of a woman out of the corner of the glass. Grandma listened closely as Joey told us a story that would be repeated many times in the coming days. Grandpa and I looked at each other. Joey's voice was shaking by this point, explaining what he had heard. It was a lullaby. The creature became angrier as it repeated itself like tape on fast forward. 2 or 3 times the speed. The song growing louder and deeper. Joey couldn't do anything but stare at the pale woman with the stained dress by the window. And just like that, it vanished. This is a peculiar case, though there really isn't much of an explanation for the events, and I've only managed to gather whatever stories locals have told me and some history from an old record that I found at the library. I moved into my parents' house when they passed away, and it was supposed to be only for a little while. The idea was for my wife and I to clean up the place and rent it out, like my parents wanted. But we liked the town and got to know the nice neighbors, and before we knew it, we had spent 3 years living there. I work from home and my wife works at a hospital, so we are at home at odd times, since I also work from coffee shops and libraries. For work, I had ordered a printer. I spent a lot of time researching it since I am terrible with technology things, and literally only know how to use my browser for research and only open Word and Excel for work. I wanted one that can print in color, and I needed it to be able to print on envelopes and labels. The one I had also included a scanner, which I thought would be useful if I ever needed to make copies of something. I was at home, and Jill had asked me to come pick her up from work at around midnight when her shift was over. I had gotten up early that morning setting up the printer, but I somehow managed to stay awake that late. It was 10 minutes until midnight when I got Jill's call saying she was ready. I was still on my cell phone when I picked up my car keys when suddenly I heard the printer fan start up and a sheet of paper came out from my desk in the living room. I walked over to the printer and looked at the blank piece of paper on the paper tray. I ignored it and shut the door behind me as I went to get Jill. When we got back, I turned off my computer, the printer, and unplugged my chargers from the desk and went to the bedroom. I was about to fall asleep when Jill nudged my arm. She had a bite of her frozen burrito in her mouth, and she told me that she heard a noise from the living room. I could see her worried face as the flashing lights from the show she was watching on TV lit up the room, though it was on mute. There it was again. It sounded like an old cassette player, or like the plasticky sounds of batteries being loaded into a remote control. We hadn't had any issues with rats or rodents anywhere, but I still turned on the lights of the room and then of the hallway to take a look. It didn't take long before I heard the noise again. It was a printer. I walked over to it, and about 5 or 6 sheets of blank paper were now resting on the tray. I looked at the flashing lights of it, and it was about to turn on again, even with my computer off. I grew a bit frustrated knowing that I had researched that thing for so long for it to be faulty like that. I unplugged it and went back to the room. Jill was holding the red wrapper of the burrito in one hand, the TV still on mute as she waited for me to speak. It was a printer, I told her. I don't know if I'll be able to return it. She was relieved and unmuted the show. I was not relieved, but I still went right back to sleep. The next morning, I plugged in my chargers, the printer, and everything, but later decided to unplug my laptop and walk over to the coffee shop down the street for coffee and to get some work done. Jill had already gone to start her shift early that morning. I got her text earlier than usual. She had gotten home already and asked at what time I would be getting there to go do the shopping for the week with her. I was almost done with my work and was literally a 15-minute walk away from the house, so I just packed up my stuff, paid, and started walking. When I got another text. That printer is still going nuts, it said. When I got there was a stack of about 30 sheets on the tray. I looked at some of the blank sheets and set them down on the desk out of frustration. Then simply grabbed my keys and went with Jill to get the groceries. She asked me about it, of course. But I didn't find out what was happening until I put the sheets back in the printer and saw something on the corner of the paper when I printed something out. It was a vertical line on the top right corner, like a pre-made marker for staples or something. But as I looked a little closer, I saw that it was more than that. It was text. More specifically, it was the line of a story. I knew that because the second sheet had the same line of text, but the story continued. From what I gathered, it was a story of a man who was searching for his brother. It went on for many sheets, and it was so small that you had to hold it up to your face to read it. If you looked closely, it almost looked handwritten. By the rivers and the hills, I looked, afraid to discover, afraid not to. It was strange, but it made sense. It sounded familiar. I couldn't put the story together in order, but I googled one line of the story to finally match up with the real text. It was from a book called Tale of a Feather by an anonymous author. Later on that week, I asked a woman at the library about it, and we looked it up. But there was only a publication date from back in the 1930s. I also asked about the history of the city, and I found out our address was on there, once a home to a journalist, who may have been also a book writer, but there was no way to ever find out. But still, how does a printer turn on like that? I know some of my friends in IT from back when I worked at the office would know how to pull these types of pranks off pretty well. But I unboxed this printer myself, and it was not connected to any network. Eventually, I read the book. It was poorly written, but had a very sad story of a lifelong search for a person who had died. If this was a sick joke of some sort, I figured I didn't want to be a part of it. But out of curiosity, I took the printer to a repair center the following week, where the nice man at the counter heard my story and told me something that I had overlooked. The printer couldn't print if it wasn't connected to a computer. That we agreed on. But the printer could still be used to make copies. All you had to do was open the scanner lid and press a button. It didn't have to be connected to anything else but the power. I couldn't understand it, honestly. But he calmly told me that it wasn't printing from a computer. It was making copies. Someone was placing a document on the scanner and pressing the copy button. Can it do that by itself? I asked, realizing how silly the question was right after I said it. No, sir, he said. So I brought the printer back, still wondering if there was some type of mistake. But the printer kept on going, usually when Jill was at the house. Eventually, it reached what I knew was the last line of the book. Despite our differences, we're together now. I haven't had printer problems since.